he was, would not listen to any excuse, but teased and tormented Mary about the crown matrimonial continually. Besides the legal difficulties in the way of Mary's conferring these powers upon Darnley by her own act, there were other difficulties doubtless in mind, arising from the character of Darnley and his unfitness, which was every day becoming more manifest, to be entrusted with such power. Only 4 months after his marriage, his rough and cruel treatment of Mary became intolerable. One day, at a house in Edinburgh, where the king and queen and other persons of distinction had been invited to a banquet, Darnley, as was his custom, was beginning to drink very freely, and was trying to urge other persons there to drink to excess. Mary expostulated with him, endeavouring to dissuade him from such a course. Darnley resented these kind cautions, and retorted upon her in so violent and brutal a manner as to cause her to leave the room and the company in tears. When they were first married, Mary had caused her husband to be proclaimed king, and had taken some other similar steps to invest him with a share of her own power. But she soon found that in doing this she had gone to the extreme of propriety, and that for the future she must retreat rather than advance. Accordingly, although he was associated with her in the supreme power, she thought it best to keep precedence for her own name before his in the exercise of power. On the coins which were struck, the inscription was, "In the name of the Queen and King of Scotland." In signing her public documents, she insisted on having her name recorded first. These things irritated and provoked Darnley more and more. He was not contented to be admitted to a share of the sovereign power which the Queen possessed in her own right alone. He wished to supplant her in it entirely. Rizzio, of course, took Queen Mary's part in these questions. He opposed the grant of the crown matrimonial. He opposed all other plans for increasing or extending in any way Darnley's power. Darnley was very much incensed against him, and earnestly desired to find some way to effect his destruction. He communicated these feelings to a certain fierce and fearless nobleman named Ruthven, and asked his assistance to contrive some way to take vengeance upon Rizzio. Ruthven was very much pleased to hear this. He belonged to a party of the lords of the court who also hated Rizzio, though they had hated Darnley, besides so much that they had not communicated to him their hostility to the other. Ruthven and his friends had not joined Murray and the other rebels in opposing the marriage of Darnley. They had chosen to acquiesce in it, hoping to maintain an ascendancy over Darnley, regarding him, as they did, as a mere boy, and thus retain their power. When they found, however, that he was so headstrong and unmanageable, and that they could do nothing with him, they exerted all their influence to have Murray and the other exiled lords pardoned and allowed to return, hoping to combine with them after their return, and then together to make their power superior to that of Darnley and Rizzio. They considered Darnley and Rizzio both as their rivals and enemies. When they found, therefore, that Darnley was plotting Rizzio's destruction, they felt a very strong as well as very unexpected pleasure. Thus, among all the jealousies and rivalries and bitter animosities of which the court was at this time the scene, the only true and honest attachment of one heart to another seems to have been that of Mary to Rizzio. The secretary was faithful and devoted to the Queen, and the Queen was grateful and kind to the secretary. There has been some question whether this attachment was an innocent or guilty one. A painting, still hanging in the private rooms which belonged to Mary in the palace at Holyrood, represents Rizzio as young and very handsome. On the other hand, some of the historians of the day, to disprove the possibility of any guilty attachment, say that he was rather old and ugly. We may ourselves, perhaps, safely infer that unless there were something specially repulsive in his appearance and manner, such a heart as Mary's, repelled so roughly from the one whom it was her duty to love, could not well have resisted the temptation to seek a retreat and refuge in the kind devotedness of such a friend as Rizzio proved himself to be to her. However this may be, Ruthven made such suggestions to Darnley as goaded him to madness, and a scheme was soon formed for putting Rizzio to death. The plan, after being deliberately matured in all its arrangements, was carried into effect in the following manner. The offence occurred early in the spring of 1566, less than a year after Mary's marriage. Morton, who was one of the accomplices, assembled a large force of his followers, consisting, it is said, of 500 men, which he posted in the evening near the palace, and when it was dark, he moved them silently into the central court of the palace, through the entrance E as marked upon the following plan. Mary was at the time of these occurrences in a little room marked C, which was built within one of the round towers which form a part of the front of the building, and which are very conspicuous in any view of the palace of Holyrood. This room was on the 3rd floor, and it opened into Mary's bedroom, marked B. Darnley had a room of his own immediately below Mary's. There was a little door, D, leading from Mary's bedroom to a private staircase built in the wall. This staircase led down into Darnley's room, and there was also a communication from this place down through the whole length of the castle to the royal chapel, marked CH, the building which is now in ruins. Behind Mary's bedroom was an anteroom, R, with a door, O, leading to the public staircase by which her apartments were approached. All these apartments still remain, and are explored annually by thousands of visitors. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening that the conspirators were to execute their purpose. Morton remained below in the court with his troops, to prevent any interruption. He held a high office under the Queen, which authorized him to bring a force into the court of the palace, and his doing so did not alarm the inmates. Ruthven was to head the party which was to commit the crime. He was confined to his bed with sickness at the time, but he was so eager to have a share in the pleasure of destroying Rizzio, that he left his bed, put on a suit of armour, and came forth to the work. The armour is preserved in the little apartment which was the scene of the tragedy to this day. Mary was at supper. 2 near relatives and friends of hers, a gentleman and a lady, and Rizzio, were with her. The room is scarcely large enough to contain a greater number. There were, however, 2 or 3 servants in attendance at a side table. Darnley came up about 8 o'clock to make observations. The other conspirators were concealed in his room below, and it was agreed that if Darnley found any cause for not proceeding with the plan, he was to return immediately and give them notice. If, therefore, he should not return, after the lapse of a reasonable time, they were to come up by this private staircase, in order to avoid being intercepted or delayed by the domestics and attendants in the anteroom, R, of which there would have been danger if they had ascended by the public staircase at T. Finding that Darnley did not return, Ruthven and his party ascended the stairs, entered the bedchamber through the little door at D, and then advanced to the door of the cabinet, his heavy iron armour clanking as he came. The Queen, alarmed, demanded the meaning of this intrusion. Ruthven, whose countenance was grim and ghastly from the conjoint influence of ferocious passion and disease, said that they meant no harm to her, but they only wanted the villain who stood near her. Rizzio perceived that his hour was come. The attendants flocked in to the assistance of the Queen and Rizzio. Ruthven's confederates advanced to join in the attack, and there ensued one of those scenes of confusion and terror, of which those who witness it have no distinct recollection on looking back upon it when it is over. Rizzio cried out in an agony of fear, and sought refuge behind the Queen. The Queen herself fainted. The table was overturned, and Rizzio, having received 1 wound from a dagger, was seized and dragged out through the bedchamber, B, and through the anteroom, R, to the door, O, where he fell down, and was stabbed by the murderers again and again, till he ceased to breathe. After this scene was over, Darnley and Ruthven came coolly back into Mary's chamber, and as soon as Mary recovered her senses, began to talk of and to justify their act of violence, without, however, telling her that Rizzio had been killed. Mary was filled with emotions of resentment and grief. She bitterly reproached Darnley for such an act of cruelty as breaking into her apartment with armed men and seizing and carrying off her friend. She told him that she had raised him from his comparatively humble position to make him her husband, and now this was his return. Darnley replied that Rizzio had supplanted him in her confidence and thwarted all his plans, and that Mary had shown herself utterly regardless of his wishes under the influence of Rizzio. He said that since Mary had made herself his wife, she ought to have obeyed him, and not put herself in such a way under the direction of another. Mary learned Rizzio's fate the next day. The violence of the conspirator did not stop with the destruction of Rizzio. Some of Mary's high officers of government, who were in the palace at the time, were obliged to make their escape from the windows to avoid being seized by Morton and his soldiers in